Welcome to the third lecture. Last week, you will remember, we looked at the ancient collections of laws from Sumeria and Babylonia and Assyria, and we learned a number of important things from them to bring with us in approaching passages from the Old Testament. First of all, these are not law codes, they are not statute laws. And there was the remarkable point quoted from the book by Saggs, that you take something like the laws of Hammurabi, they are never referred to in any of the hundreds of cases that we know about where cases are being dealt with. There is no reference to any of these laws of Hammurabi as being important or deciding anything or anything like that. We came to see that these collections of laws are representative more of justice than being detailed regulations about what to do and what not to do. We also saw that where they had material in common, one reason for this was because in order to become a judge, you had to become a scribe. In order to become a scribe, you had to learn to read a language that was written with something like 600 syllabic signs, so that entry to this profession was somewhat restricted. And one way in which you learned first to become a scribe and then to become a judge was by copying out collections of laws. So we looked at all that, and then we began to look at the various sources of the collections of law in the Old Testament. We saw, first of all, those what we might call informal social arrangements, such as blood feud, blood revenge, and the attempts to bring blood revenge under greater centralized control. We looked at disputes between families and disputes being settled between families. We looked at justice in the gate, where lay elders were called together to sit and constitute a kind of court and to decide cases, and then eventually to the centralized administration of justice and the collection of laws in that connection. But, and this is point one on the handout, the collection of laws in the Old Testament has been compiled from various types and times of legal practice. Secondly, the laws are not exhaustive. I reminded you last week that if you look at the content, the range of the collections of laws in the Old Testament, they are extremely limited and narrow. And I was reminding you that in Orthodox Judaism, the belief is that God revealed two laws to Moses, the written law, the Torah shebichtav, and the oral law, the Torah sheba'al peh. And the oral law, which has now been written down, occupies volumes and volumes and volumes, covering subjects that are nowhere mentioned in the Old Testament collections, although there can sometimes be some interaction between what is written and what is oral. And then point three, the laws are illustrative. And I want to add a further point, though I can't really elaborate it because I don't have time. There is a connection between the collections of laws in the Old Testament and the so-called wisdom traditions, especially those in the book of Proverbs. And again, this is not so surprising because, as I said last week, one of the ways in which people learned to become scribes, and if they were going on to higher things to become judges, was by copying out Proverbs, the kind of Proverbs that we have in the book of Proverbs and the kind of Proverbs we have in Egypt and Babylon and so on. What we're going to do this evening is we're going to look at just a selection of the laws from the so-called Covenant Code, or the Book of the Covenant. In Exodus chapter 24, there is a ceremony in which a covenant between God and the Israelites is made. And part of that covenant is the reading of the book of the covenant. And it is usually assumed that by the book of the covenant is meant what we have roughly from Exodus chapter 20 through to the end of Exodus chapter 23. Although the beginning of chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments, and people argue a little bit about the exact delineation. I've put down Exodus 21:1, but it might be at the end of chapter 20, but it doesn't really matter. So this is called the covenant, and I put code in inverted commas because whatever else it isn't a code, as you shall see. Now, the other thing I'm going to do this evening is that I want to try to help you experience the Hebrew text, even though I imagine that many of you here are not familiar with the Hebrew language. But it is important to engage with the text in Hebrew if we are to understand how it has come into being and what it is about. This is why I have printed out for you the authorized version of the Bible, because the authorized version is one of those versions that makes a clear distinction between the second person singular and the second person plural. Now, modern translations don't make that distinction, so you don't get any help from a modern translation as to what is actually going on in the Hebrew. And here and there, I have actually, in the first verses, I've actually had to tell you that even the authorized version hasn't properly translated what is in the Hebrew, and there are good reasons for that. And I've tried to put into bold type passages where you have the second person plural. Remember, of course, that in the time of the Elizabethan and King James Bibles, the second person plural in English was ye for the nominative and vocative, and you for the accusative. And in the course of time, it is the accusative you that has, as it were, taken over the whole thing, and ye has dropped out. And of course, the second person singular was thou. Still in use in certain parts of Yorkshire and County Durham and perhaps elsewhere. And here and there I have tried to put into italics passages that I think are supplements to what we have. Now, this is the next point. It's tremendously important to realize that in the ancient world, the roles of author, editor, redactor, copyist all shade into each other. They're not clearly distinguished, and that sometimes is a problem for modern readers of the Bible, because we tend to think if someone has written a text, they have sat down and written it, or these days typed it, or word processed it, and that's how it comes about. This is not the case in the ancient world. Texts are added to. They come into being by a process of supplementation. Now, some people find this worrying. Doesn't this undermine or challenge the authority of the Bible? No, it only challenges the authority and inspiration of the Bible if you think, first of all, in terms of modern authors, and secondly, that God can only work through particular individuals and cannot work through processes. So nothing that I'm going to say is meant in any way to threaten people's faith in the authority and inspiration of the Bible. It always surprises me that people want to limit the power of God, to say that he can inspire an individual, but he can't inspire several people who are involved in producing a text. I'd like to know why he can do the one, not the other. Okay, so I want us first of all to look on the handout at verses 21 to 24. Now, this is a lovely example of how we see two different types of instruction, as it were, dovetailed together, and dovetailed together in such a way that this has caused problems for the translator. So let's look first of all at verse 21 in the ordinary type. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. I'll come back to that in a minute. If thou afflict them, verse 23, Hebrew him in any wise, and they, Hebrew he, cries at all unto me, I will surely hear their Hebrew his cry. Now, why has the Authorized Version in verse 23 therefore translated on 3 occasions a singular verb as a plural? And this is because in the process of the supplementation of this text, we have now got in an additional bit. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child in verse 22. And so if you're going to go on and translate this according to the sense, you've got to have him and they and there in order to make sense, through some sort of sense in your own language. I mean, it would sound very odd if you said, you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child if thou afflict him, and he cries, but the immediate antecedent is the widow and fatherless child. Do you see what I mean? So the Hebrew gives us a clue to how these verses have come together in the form in which we have them. Clearly, we begin with verse 21, the first part, and verse 23. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. If thou afflict him in any wise, and he cries at all unto me, I will surely hear his cry. And there has been rather nicely dovetailed with that another instruction. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. My wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. And the combining, therefore, of these two laws or instructions together produces then the passage from 21 to 24 and puts the translator into some difficulty in verse 23 with regard to how to translate the singulars. Let's now have a look at the detail. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. I'll just open the Hebrew here. A minute. Because what we've probably got here is something that occurs again frequently in the Bible in Hebrew. That you may get a Hebrew verb which is rare, and so it is explained by a much better known verb that immediately follows it. And this is what has happened here, though the way the Authorized Version has translated it, as it were, eases some of the difficulty that we find when we look at the Hebrew. But the Hebrew says you must not, whatever the word vex means, it doesn't occur very often, and somebody has then explained what that means with a better known verb, oppress him. Now, a stranger is a man or a woman, Israelite or non-Israelite, estranged from their home and their family. If we wanted a modern equivalent, we might say this was a homeless person, a person without a family to support them and a place to live. In other words, such a person is highly vulnerable. And how are you going to impress upon people the need to protect someone who is vulnerable in this way? Now, next week, when I talk about the Deuteronomic Code, collection, I think it's pardon, these old habits are difficult to get rid of. The Deuteronomic collection, we shall see some provisions there for doing good things for strangers and widows and orphans, but we'll leave that until next week. Here, what is made clear is that it is God himself who is the protector of the stranger, the modern equivalent of the homeless. If thou afflict him in any wise, and he cries unto me at all, I will surely hear his cry. So a strong theological point is being made here. Where there are vulnerable people, namely strangers, without the protection of humankind, God is the protector of such people. Now, this instruction having existed, someone comes along at some stage to add two more people to the list of those who are vulnerable and who come under God's protection, namely the widow and the fatherless child, for obvious reasons, in a society where you have extended families and the need of the family to protect individuals. If you're a widow or an orphan, you're in a very difficult position. And the divine part of this, in verse 24, is then very strongly emphasized. My wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. Now that, of course, could be easily said, this is the nasty, hostile, cruel, Old Testament. But it's making a point. It's making a point that if people take advantage of those who are without the protection of others, this is something that should provoke wrath and anger. We should be justifiably angry at the sort of world in which we live, which is why I said, I think 2 weeks ago, judgment for me is part of the good news. It's not something we need to be saved from. It's part of the gospel that God is going to judge the world and judge the world righteously and justly. Verse 25, if thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee. And again, the authorized version tries to smooth over something that is quite awkward in the Hebrew, and something that is made a lot of by Jewish interpreters. I brought with me the commentary of the famous medieval Jewish commentator Rashi, and he is one of the great and important commentators, and not only on the text of the Bible in Hebrew, but also on the so-called oral law. Anyway, I won't go into the problem here. Thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. Now, two things to comment here. For most of the history of the Christian church up to now, until the 16th century, it was absolutely forbidden to be a usurer, that is, to lend money and charge interest. Early church councils have canons that have all sorts of excommunication sentences against people against Christians who lend money out at interest or associate with people who lend money out on interest. And there were various reasons for this. The prohibition in the Old Testament, we get it also in Deuteronomy, and a passage in Luke chapter 6 where Jesus appears to say, lend to people expecting nothing in return. And so the Old Testament and the example of Jesus were held for centuries by the church to forbid entirely the charging of any sort of interest. And one of the baddies here, if you think that interest is a bad thing, is Calvin. Luther holds to the medieval view that usury should not be charged. Calvin is rather scornful of this idea. And of course, in Islamic tradition, the charging of interest is entirely forbidden. What happens in Islamic banking is that no interest is charged, but of course you're charged for the service. The debt is, as it were, service. So in a way, it is got round that way. And it began to be got round that way within sort of Western Catholic theology, because that also forbade usury. And then you began to get the idea that usury or charging interest wasn't in itself bad. It was the charging of excessive interest that was bad. But of course the difficulty with usury is that it takes advantage of people. Somebody who needs a loan is or could be in a vulnerable position. I mean, we see it today very much, don't we, with young couples who want to buy houses. And they can't buy houses because they can't get the loans, or people wanting to start businesses. They can't start the businesses because they can't get the loans. And the people who control the money, after all, I don't have to mention bankers, right? The people who control it are in a powerful position as over against people who need it. And there's no accident that some of the parables of Jesus about sin and forgiveness take up this theme of debt and indebtedness and usury and interest. The last bit of this, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury, uses the rather nice Hebrew word neshech, because there were two ways in the ancient world in which you could charge people interest. Now, of course, we're not talking about money. The Hebrew word kesef means literally silver, and it means pieces of silver. And it wasn't a monetary economy in ancient Israel, but you weighed things. There were weights. A shekel was a weight, and so you could have a weight of corn or grain and a weight of silver pieces, and so on. And this is how you did it. But let's forget about that and get on for a moment, and let's imagine do it in pounds. There are two ways I can be a usurer in the ancient world. One is that I lend you £100 and you pay me back 120, and that is called a rabit. That means making it get bigger. And the other is neshech, which means biting. And what it means is that if you want to borrow from me £100, I give you 80. And you give me back 100. And so the point is that the bit of interest is bitten off right at the beginning. This is neshech. The other way of charging interest, and this is what it has in the text here. Verse 25, so here we go on, because I can talk for hours about these passages. If thou wilt all take thy neighbour's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down. And this is interesting again. Someone needing, I suppose, to have some sort of temporary loan and needs security about it. Okay, if you take your neighbour's garment, you've got to give it back, because, as it says in verse 27, this explanation, for that is his covering only, it is his raiment for his skin, wherein shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass, when he crieth unto me, that I will hear, for I am gracious. And again, the protector of the person who is in this vulnerable position of needing to pledge his garment in order to get some alleviation for whatever reason. God is the protector and guarantor of this. Now the next verse, thou shalt not revile the gods. And I put an asterisk there to remind you that the authorized version of the Bible, I spoke a lot about this in the lectures last year, the authorized version of the Bible has a margin, and if you have an authorized version without a margin, it's a defective authorized version. And the margin says judges. There is a tradition in Jewish interpretation that the word that can be translated God or gods also means judges. Why so? If, as a lot of modern translations take it, it means you must not revile God. But this is God speaking. Surely if God is speaking, he would say you mustn't revile me. Why should God say you mustn't revile God? And hence the traditional Jewish translation is you shall not revile the judges. You shall not revile the judges. And the authorized version, as so often in its margin, is following the Jewish interpretation of this. The idea that you should not revile the gods goes back to Josephus, right back to the first century, who said that, he thought it meant, and quite wrongly, that it meant that Jews should respect the pagan gods. One can hardly see why they should, or why anybody could think the text could mean that. Now the next thing is, all of a sudden, we are getting over into things that are really not so much about social justice, but about ritual holiness. Thou shalt not delay to offer the first of thy ripe fruits and of thy liquors. The firstborn of thy sons thou shalt give unto me. There is again this sense that the firstborn of everything and the first fruits of everything belong to God, because God is the creator. And he is the one who is responsible, ultimately, for what the earth produces and for what humankind produces and what animal produces. And in recognition of that, therefore, these things should be offered to God. A reminder, therefore, that the created world is not there to be exploited by humankind entirely for its own interests, without any consideration of anything else. And you get in verse 30 a typical piece of drafting that goes on here. Okay, you spoke about these, and you do the same. Likewise shalt thou do with thine ox and with thy sheep. 7 days it shall be with his dam, on the 8th day thou shalt give it to me. And then verse 31, all of a sudden we get back into the second person plural. And ye shall be holy men unto me. Neither shall ye eat any flesh that is torn of beasts in the field. Ye shall cast it to the dogs. I apologise to dog lovers that dogs, even still today in the Middle East, are not thought to be the sort of rather nice, loyal pets that they are for us. And of course what it is referring to here is the fact that if meat is eaten, it has to be properly killed. Heavens, I mean, you go around, practically every shop you see in Sheffield has got halal written in Arabic, because that is the same principle, that the meat has to be killed in a particular way so that the blood is drained. And all of a sudden, this is brought in. And one thing I'm going to comment on it, how you've got this lovely mixture of regulations that have to do with social justice, but also with holiness. And there's ritual holiness, and there's no great division in a way. Holiness is a practical thing as well as a ritual thing. Now the next passage really has to do with the administration of justice. Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Now, the reason I've put those words in the second part of that verse in bold italics is because there are two ways in Hebrew of giving a negative command. Now, the normal way that you give a negative command in Hebrew and in Arabic, you don't use the imperative with the negative. You don't say, do not do something. You use the negative with the imperfect. You shall not do something. Okay? Now in commandments, you use an unusual word for the not. It's law, and then followed by the imperfect. But the usual way of giving a negative command is not to say law, but to say al. So when you get commandments in Hebrew with law, this is emphasizing that they are commandments. And the thing here is that in this verse 1, you've got the law, thou shalt not raise a false report, but when it says put not thine hand with the wicked, this is the al, the different way of expressing the imperative. And this suggests, therefore, that we've got an amplification of the first part of that verse. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. This is probably about resisting the temptation if you are caught up in having to vote in a case, from going with the majority because you're frightened of what will happen if you don't go with the majority. You've got to stick to your own opinion even if you're in a minority of one. It's interesting that when you get into the Jewish law, later Jewish law, in the tractate Sanhedrin, there you've got where it talks about how courts of justice, you've always got an odd number of judges. And when it comes to giving the decision, each judge gives his decision individually, beginning with the most junior and working up to the most senior, in order to prevent the idea, if you start with the most senior, the most junior may think that he's got to agree. It's marvellous when you look into these little details of Jewish and post-biblical Jewish law. And neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. In other words, you've got to be so impartial in judgment, that you don't say, well, this is a poor chap, therefore I've really got to speak up for him. You've got to be as impartial as you can. And then you've got these fascinating ones in verses 4 and 5. If thou meet thine enemy's ox, or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. Now, the commentators say that what this probably means, within the context of cases, that this is somebody with whom you are in dispute legally. This is your enemy. And therefore the fact that you've got a disagreement with him mustn't prejudice the way you treat with him. The next verse, if thou see the ass of him that hateth thee, lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. But even if it's, we give it a wider implication, you see there, in the first bit, you've got to be nice to your enemy's ox, and particularly in the next bit, nice to your enemy's ass. And these laws are often shot through, as we shall see particularly in a minute, with compassion for animals. Next verse, thou shalt not rest to the judgment of thy poor in his cause. 7, keep thee far from a false matter. And the innocent and righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. I mean, what that means, it doesn't mean the actual slaying of people. It means slaying them by giving the sort of verdict, a false verdict, that would bring death upon them. Thou shalt take no gift, fairly relevant to things that are happening at the moment in the Levinson inquiry and so on. Take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. Now verse 9, we seem to be back where we started. Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger. And I call this next bit an imperative redemption. Ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. The Israelites are often reminded that because God showed compassion to them in bringing them out of slavery, they must show compassion to each other, and they must live together as those who rely upon the undeserved mercy of God in freeing them from slavery and making them a people. Verse 10, 6 years thou shalt sow thy land, and shalt gather in the fruits thereof, but in the 7th year thou shalt let it rest and lie still. This is not an agricultural command. We know from research into agriculture in ancient Canaan that because they didn't have fertilizers and that sort of thing, well, they did. They used vegetable fertilizers wherever they could. If you had a field, you divided it into half. 1 year you sowed that half and let that half lie fallow. Next year you sowed that half and let that half lie fallow in order to preserve the strength of the ground. So this business about letting the earth rest every 7th year is not just about an agricultural necessity. It is again a way of saying the land does not belong to you to be exploited as you want. And then we get some interesting expansions of the law. That the poor of thy people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field shall eat. And then the next bit, you see another nice little expansion. In like manner thou shalt deal with thy vineyard and with thy olive yard. See, there's nothing to do with agriculture, because people don't fallow their vineyards and their olives. They produce regularly. So the point is that what you must do is that you mustn't collect the produce in the 7th year. You must leave the produce of your olive yard and your vineyard for the poor and the wild animals. And then we finish up with my favourite version of the Sabbath commandment, verses 12 and 13. 6 days thou shalt do thy work, and on the 7th day thou shalt rest. Why? That thine ox and thine ass may rest, and the son of thy handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. Now we see here an Israelite family as a household. A household that is going to include not only those related by blood, but also people taking refuge. The stranger is there. And the son of thy handmaid, the handmaid is a female slave, and it will be her son. All people involved in the work of the household. But the household seems to include the ox and the ass as well. and the rest is to embrace all of them on the seventh day. Again, a way of saying that not just space, but time belongs to God, and it must be offered back to God and acknowledged in this way. And then the whole thing finishes up, this little collection, verse 13, with a nice you thing. In all things that I have said unto you, be circumspect. Make no mention of the name of other gods. And then a nice little contradiction here with what I've said. Neither let it be heard out of thy mouth. Something slightly complicated going on there, how all that's been put together. Now, what do we make of this collection of laws? We see that they cover ritual things, the offering of first fruits, the observance of the Sabbath, the offering of the firstborn, and so on. It has to do with the administration of justice. It has to do with social justice and arrangements. And the person who originates and guarantees all these things is God. So that what we have here is theology rather than law. And what these laws are meant to show us, therefore, is the kind of people that should be living together and the way they should be living together, who are God's people brought into being by God's grace and God's mercy. And more of the same next week when we look at some collections of laws from the book of Deuteronomy.